welcome back to the drawing board with me, Steven Lloyd, and in this New Year episode we'll be talking about designing for risk. The reason I say risk is because we can never be 100% certain that a structure will be stable and no building lasts forever. But it's the designer's responsibility to make sure as far as they can that they limit these risks and try to reduce as far as possible the chance of any failure. The whole of Eurocode can be boiled down into one side of A4 in Eurocode 0 that goes about setting out all of the basic requirements. It tells you that a structure needs to be designed and then built in such a way that it's reliable and economical and that it will resist any of the actions and influences that are likely to occur. You'll never see a building designed for comet impact because that'll never happen, but what you will see are buildings that are designed to resist the loads of people walking around inside them, wind hitting the side of them and so on. You'll also see them designed to resist fire. Any kind of structure needs to resist fire for long enough that it will allow either people to safely evacuate or will survive in a safe and stable way for the fire to be tackled. You also have to make sure a structure will not be damaged to a disproportionate extent, that's an important word here, by accidental impacts, explosions, or the effects of human error. The disproportionate is important. You can allow a building to be damaged. It seems obvious that if a car drives into the front of a building, the front of the building will be damaged. What you want to make sure in the design is that just because part of the building is damaged, it won't cause a knock-on effect and a domino effect that will cause other parts of the structure to collapse. The ways that you can avoid disproportionate damage are by eliminating or reducing the hazards. So taking the car impact as the example again, we could erect bollards around a structure so that a vehicle can't actually reach the important part of the structure. You could design the structure to have a low sensitivity to impact. So for instance, we could create columns that are very thick, very large, so that even if a vehicle did impact them, it would still remain standing with very little damage. The third is that even if the column was knocked out, for instance, by the vehicle, the rest of the building would survive even without a column. So there's redundancy built in. The fourth is to avoid any system. This is more of a rule. Avoid any system that will have a sudden or brittle failure. What you want are nice, slow, ductile failures that you can see happening and that people can get out of the way before it happens. The fifth rule is tying things together. A single weak element can become quite strong if it's tied together with other neighbours. It's very unlikely that you'll get failure at the same time in multiple locations. So tying things together such that other members around can help is often a really good way of avoiding disproportionate damage. Take the example of a steel cable holding up a bridge. Each single steel fibre in itself isn't that strong, but when they're wound together into a large cable, the tying of all of those fibres together makes a very strong unit. That kind of principle can also apply to structural members in buildings as well as individual fibres in a cable. We take a probabilistic approach to design and to risk. We're working out really the chances of an effect happening on a building and the chance of the particular element of the building being strong enough to resist that. I'm sure everybody's quite familiar with the limit state diagram here. What affects the factors used and what affects the breadth and the height of these probability curves? Several things here. What are the potential modes of failure? What are the consequences? The public aversion to that kind of failure. This is a bit of a funny one, but it's there in the Eurocodes that you can apply different factors if a particular type of building is sensitive in the public eye. And the expense and level of work and process that you have to put in order to prevent a failure. So I use agricultural stores as quite a good example. The risk of them hurting anybody if they fail in some way is quite low. The economic damage is quite low. So you might be quite tempted to use very slim partial factors of safety and get quite a lean design. Whereas something that is very much in the public eye, a monumental building, something like a stadium that also wants to last for a long time, you might use much broader factors of safety to ensure that that is much more reliable, although at the cost of a little economy. Combinations of effects. Again, this is coming back to the risk and taking a probabilistic approach. If you have multiple effects happening at the same time, do you need to design the building to resist every single one of them all added together? The argument, certainly in Eurocode, is no, you don't. I'll give the example of why down here. Imagine you had a couple of 100-sided dice. What's the chance of you rolling a 100 on that dice? And I'm going to relate that to the probability of there being a force that is big enough to collapse your building. There's only a 1 in 100 chance that a very large gust of wind will come across, let's say. The chance of rolling 100 on the dice is 1 in 100. But let's say we had two different forces, so we have two dice. We roll them both. What's the chance of rolling two 100s on both dice? It's 1 in 10,000. Would we have to design that building to resist the 1 in 100 and the other 1 in 100? No, because the chances of that happening are very slim. Let's look at this another way. What's the chances of rolling something higher than a 90, 91, 92, 93 and so on? It's 1 in 10. The chances of us with two dice rolling both of them and getting higher than a 90, it's 1 in 10 times 1 in 10, it's 1 in 100 again. So this is how the Eurocodes deal with it, with combination factors. They reduce the allowable level of that effect, of that force, to such an extent that when combined with others, the probability of the whole thing coming to that total is the same as any one that you were looking at before. So these are your little psi factors that you use in Eurocodes. So they'll reduce the size of a force such that the probability of it all happening still stays around about the same. Acceptable failure now. So we've tried to limit the chance of a failure happening by taking appropriate factors. But what if a failure does happen? There are such things as acceptable failure, particularly in temporary works. Whilst you're still working on a building, you may do something wrong. You may knock a prop out with an excavator. Talking about loss of prop is almost a whole drawing board in itself, and I'll probably do another drawing board on that separate to this one that specifically talks about loss of prop in excavations. But concentrating just generally more on structures here, there are times when you will see a failure, and what we also want to do is to manage how that failure might occur. Is a failure acceptable? So you look at, does it have risk to health or life? If the risk is low, then it might be acceptable. What's the probability of occurrence? Now, we might look at the way a structure fails, and if the chance of it failing in a very obscure manner is very, very, very unlikely, we might accept that in our design. The cost of prevention might be prohibitive. So if it actually costs more to prevent a particular kind of failure than it would to actually build the building, would we bother preventing it? And will the mode of failure be slow and controlled and obvious? If it's a very slow failure because of durability and it happens over many months or years, then we probably won't be too worried because we'll be able to repair and address it. So I'll give an example here. Let's say that a pipe bursts and a lot of water floods into an area and overloads an area of floor, overloads the column beneath. That is a failure, not something we could have designed for, because we didn't know that that accidental occurrence was going to happen. But it's an acceptable failure because even though that column has buckled under that extra weight, we've used the rules that we talked about down in this corner here, we've tied the elements together, there's a bit of redundancy, that this structure as a whole will remain standing. You may have to come back and address this, you're going to have to repair all that, replace this column, but it's an acceptable failure that hasn't led to a complete collapse. The second was redundancy, so that you can have a loss of a prop or a loss of a support or member. In this case, we've designed these members so they're strong enough that even without half of the props in, the whole thing remains stable and standing. That would be an acceptable failure. The failure of removing that prop doesn't lead to any further collapse. What would be unacceptable is if the collapse of this particular column or supporting member overloaded the two beside it, which each then collapsed, which then you're looking at the member next to that and will that collapse? And this caused a domino effect that ripples throughout the building. Regulations were changed years ago when a small collapse in a corner of a high-rise building led to most of that structure collapsing. And so redundancy in structures is very important. I will come on to talk about loss of prop in excavations in the next drawing board, but hopefully that's given you a bit of an idea about how you design and cope with risk and the approach using probabilities. And I hope you join me next time on Back to the Drawing Board.